Pull up a chair, my dear ones, and let the steam from this coffee warm your face for a moment. I'm so glad you decided to spend a bit of your day listening to an old woman's memories. Out here in my backyard in Lexington, my grandchildren are running wild and laughing, and the smell of this apple butter bubbling in my copper pot is thick enough to taste. It's a sweet smell, a peaceful smell. But to get to this peace, I had to walk through a valley of deep shadows and humiliation. I want to tell you my story not because it's easy, but because it's a story of a courage I didn't even know was hiding inside my chest. It all began in 1947. In a small wooden house tucked away on the outskirts of Hazard, Kentucky. We lived right near the banks of the North Fork of the Kentucky River, where the water always seemed to have a story of its own to tell. My father was Walter Roberts, a coal truck driver who spent his days hauling heavy loads from the mines to the towns across the ridges. My mother was Caroline May Henderson, a woman whose face looked like it had been carved right out of the mountain stone, hard cold, and rarely ever showing a true smile. Our house was big, but it had to be. I was the youngest of 13 children, and the only girl in a sea of 12 boisterous brothers. My father was a man of few words, but he was my rock. When he was home between his long trips, he'd bring me little treasures, a piece of rock, candy, or a colorful ribbon that made me feel like the most important girl in the world. He called me his little dove, and he made sure no one ever laid a finger on me. If my brothers tried to pin their mischief on me, his deep voice would boom through the house. The girl didn't do that. Leave her be. But while my father provided protection, my mother provided a heavy silence. She looked at me like I was a burden she was forced to carry. I spent my days helping her shell beans and peel potatoes under the old oak tree, but she rarely spoke to me with any kindness. Even as a little girl, I saw the way she looked at me when she thought I wasn't watching, a look of pure contempt, as if she were waiting for the day my father wouldn't be there to stand in her way. I didn't know then that the life I knew was balanced on a very thin thread, and that thread was about to snap. What happens to a little dove when her protector is suddenly gone? And why was my mother looking at me with such hunger in her eyes as the sky began to darken over Hazard? Growing up as the only girl among 12 brothers in the late 40s was like being a single wildflower in a field of tall, aggressive weeds. My brother's boys like Roger, Silas, and Miller were loud, rough, and constantly demanding. In that house, a woman's work was never ending, and even at 6 or 7 years old, my hands were always pruned from dishwater, or stained green from snapping beans. But I didn't mind the work back then, because as long as my father, Walter, was alive, there was a boundary no one dared to cross. He was the sun that kept the frost of my mother's heart from freezing me solid. My mother, Caroline, was a mystery to me. Most mothers in the mountains were the heart of the home, but she was more like its stone foundation, unyielding and cold. She didn't tuck me in. She didn't hum while she worked. She moved through the house with a rhythmic, joyless efficiency. I used to watch her through the banisters of the stairs, wondering what I had done to make her look at me with such resentment. It wasn't just that I was a girl. It was as if she saw me as a rival for my father's meager affections. She was the silent architect of the family dynamic. While my father was away driving those coal trucks, she would whisper into the ears of my older brothers. I'd catch them congregating in the kitchen, their voices dropping to a low hiss when I entered. She was raising them to believe that women were either servants or burdens, and since I was the smallest and the youngest, I was the easiest target. Roger, the oldest and the meanest, took to her lessons like a duck to water. He'd intentionally tracked mud across the floor I'd scrubbed, looking at our mother for a smirk of approval. She never corrected him. She'd just look at the mess, then at me, and point to the bucket. I lived in 2 different worlds. One world was full of light, appearing every weekend when my father's truck pulled into the gravel drive. In that world, I was a princess in a hand-me-down dress. The other world was the one my mother ruled, a world of sharp elbows, cold stares, and the growing feeling that I was being tolerated only because my father's shadow was still cast over the doorway. I didn't realize it then, but she was, just waiting for the light to go out. She was preparing my brothers for a version of our family where I didn't have a seat at the table. But the mountains have a way of changing your life in a heartbeat. One rainy Tuesday, the usual sound of my father's truck didn't echo through the valley at its usual time. Instead, a black car I didn't recognize began the slow climb up our driveway. My mother stood at the window, her face as still as a frozen pond. Why was the sheriff walking toward our porch with his hat in his hand, and why did my mother turn to me with a look that wasn't grief, but something much more terrifying? The air in the mountains changes right before a storm. It gets heavy and thick, making it hard to draw a full breath. That's how the house felt. The moment the sheriff stepped onto our porch, I was only 9 years old, but I remember the way the floorboards creaked under his heavy boots. He didn't have to say the words out loud for us to know. My father's coal truck had gone over a steep embankment during a flash flood. He was gone. In a house with 13 children, you'd expect a chorus of wailing, but the silence that followed was more deafening than any scream. My brothers stood like statues, but my mother, she didn't shed a single tear. She just nodded, thanked the sheriff, and closed the door. In that moment, the light in our home didn't just flicker, it went out completely. My protector, the man who called me his little dove, was being returned to the earth, and I was left standing in the shadows of 12 hungry wolves and a queen, who finally had her crown. The funeral was a blur of black wool and the smell of damp Kentucky soil. I remember reaching out to touch my mother's hand for comfort as they lowered the casket, but she pulled away as if my skin were hot iron. She didn't look at the grave. She looked at my brothers. A silent pact was being sealed right there over my father's resting place. When we returned to the house that evening, the change was instantaneous. The boundary my father had maintained for years vanished before the mud was even dry on our shoes. That night, for the first time in my life, I went to bed hungry. Not because we were out of food. The neighbors had brought over hams and biscuits, enough to feed an army, but because when I reached for a plate, my oldest brother Roger slapped my hand away. My mother sat at the head of the table, calmly sipping her tea, watching the exchange with a chilling indifference. "She hasn't earned her keep today," Roger sneered. I looked to my mother, waiting for the lever bee that usually saved me. It never came. I lay in the dark that night, the walls of the house feeling like they were closing in. The floorboards above me groaned with the weight of my brothers, who were already dividing up my father's things. I realized then that I wasn't a sister to them anymore, and I certainly wasn't a daughter to the woman in the next room. I was something else entirely. How does a 9-year-old survive in a house where her name is replaced by insults? And what was the special place my mother was already preparing for me in the backyard? If the weeks following my father's funeral were a cold rain, the months that followed were a freezing blizzard. The transition from the baby of the family to the house servant happened so fast it made my head spin. My mother didn't even call me by my name anymore. It was always "Girl, scrub this," or "Girl, fetch the wood." I became a ghost in my own home, visible only when there was a chore to be done or a frustration to be vented. The cruelty of my 12 brothers grew like a patch of poison ivy. Without my father's presence to check them, they vied for my mother's favor by treating me with the most disdain. Roger was the worst. He took pleasure in finding ways to remind me that I was at the very bottom of the family ladder. I remember one evening, the smell of fried chicken filled the kitchen, a rare treat. I had spent all day plucking the feathers and cleaning the meat. My stomach was cramping with hunger. When it was time to eat, I reached for a plate, but Roger pulled the stack away. "You don't eat at the table with men," he said, his voice dripping with a cruel pride. He looked at my mother, waiting for her to intervene. She didn't even look up from her greens. Instead, she reached under the sink and pulled out a chipped, rusted metal bowl, the kind we used to feed the hounds. She tossed it onto the porch floor. "Fill that with the scraps," she said coldly. "That's her place now." I ate on the porch that night, shivering in the mountain air, tears blurring my vision as I picked at bones and gristle. I felt a shame that no child should ever know. I looked through the window at the warm yellow light of the kitchen where my family laughed and ate, and I realized the house I grew up in was gone. This was a prison, and the bars were made of the very people who were supposed to love me. But the porch wasn't the end of my mother's plan for me. She began to eye my small bedroom upstairs, the one my father had built specifically for me. My brothers were getting older, and they wanted more space for their cards and their whiskey. One morning, I found my few belongings, my tattered doll, and my extra dress piled in the dirt outside. "Where am I supposed to sleep?" I asked, my voice trembling. My mother pointed her bony finger toward the old barn at the edge of the property, where the air was thick with the scent of manure and hay. with the rest of the livestock," she replied. As the sun began to set behind the jagged peaks of Hazard, I walked toward that dark, drafty barn. I was terrified of the dark, but I was more terrified of the people inside that house. Little did I know, it was in the silence of that barn that I would find the first spark of the fire. I needed to survive. What happens to a girl's spirit when she is forced to sleep among the shadows and the beasts? And what was the strange, shimmering light I saw near the rafters that changed everything? The barn was a skeletal structure of graying timber and rusted tin, standing 100 yards from the warmth of the main house. Moving there felt like being erased. My mother hadn't just taken my bed, she had taken my humanity. I spent my first night huddled on a pile of moldy burlap sacks, the mountain air whistling through the gaps in the wood like a low, mocking flute. Every rustle of a mouse or a hoot of an owl sent a jolt of terror through me. I was 9 years old, and I was sleeping where we kept the plow tools. As the weeks turned into months, my appearance began to match my surroundings. My hair, once kept neat by my father's insistence, became a matted tangle. My skin was gray with ash and dirt. Inside the house, my mother and brothers lived as if I were a chore they had completed. They would leave my dog dish on the porch steps, and I would wait until they retreated inside to eat the cold remains of their dinner. I was becoming an animal, losing the memory of what it felt like to be a little dove. One night, the despair reached a fever pitch. A heavy snow had fallen, and the temperature in the barn dropped so low my breath came out in thick white clouds. I pulled the burlap sacks over my head and wept, wishing I could just fall asleep and wake up in the arms of my father. I felt a darkness deeper than the night pressing in on me, a feeling that I was born for this, that I was meant to be nothing. But then something happened. In the corner of the rafters, a great horned owl let out a piercing cry. I looked up, and for a moment, the moonlight hitting the frost on the wood looked like a shimmering figure. I thought of my father's face. I remembered the way he looked at me, not as a servant, but as a person of value. I heard his voice in my heart, as clear as a bell. "Don't you let them break you, dove. You've got the mountain's blood in you." In that freezing barn, a tiny spark of defiance caught fire. I realized that if I stayed, I would eventually wither away until there was nothing left but a skeleton in the hay. My mother expected me to break. My brothers expected me to serve until I died. But for the first time, I began to think of a third option. I didn't have to stay. I looked at the heavy barn door, and instead of a barrier, I saw a gateway. How does a child with no shoes and no money plan a getaway from a mountain she's never left? And what did I see through the window of Roger's room that gave me the key to my escape? The moment I decided to leave, I stopped being a victim and became an actress. I realized that if my mother or brothers suspected I was planning to run, they would lock the barn doors or, worse, find a way to make sure I could never walk away. So I played the part they expected. I kept my head down lower than ever. I accepted their insults without a flinch. I even let Roger trip me in the mud and simply stood up, wiped my face, and kept walking. I wanted them to believe my spirit was finally extinguished. But behind my dull eyes, my mind was racing. I began to observe the rhythms of the house like a scout behind enemy lines. I knew that on Friday nights, my brothers would sit in the parlor with a jug of moonshine, and by midnight, the house would be filled with the heavy rhythmic snoring of men who felt too powerful to be challenged. That would be my window. However, freedom required more than just timing. It required resources. I had no shoes that fit, and I didn't have a penny to my name. Then, one afternoon, while I was scrubbing the porch, I looked through the window into Roger's room. He was counting a small pile of coins he'd won in a card game, tossing them into a rusted tobacco tin he kept on his nightstand. That tin became my North Star. It wasn't just money. It was my ticket to a bus, a loaf of bread, and a life where I didn't have to eat from a dog dish. 3 nights later, the house went quiet. The moon was a thin sliver, offering just enough light to see the frost on the grass. I crept out of the barn, my heart hammering against my ribs like a trapped bird. Every snap of a twig sounded like a gunshot. I reached the porch, slipped off my tattered rags to move more silently, and pushed the back door open. The smell of stale tobacco and grease hit me. I moved through the kitchen, past the room where my mother slept, her breathing shallow and cold even in sleep, and reached Roger's door. My hand shook as I reached for the tin. I could hear his heavy breathing just feet away. I grabbed the tin, tucked it into the small bundle of clothes I'd hidden under my arm, and backed away. I didn't look back. I stepped out into the freezing Kentucky night, the coins clinking softly, the sweetest music I had ever heard. I wasn't just a girl anymore. I was a thief in the eyes of the Roberts family, but I was a hero in my own. I began to run toward the tree line, but as I reached the edge of our property, I heard a floorboard creak from the porch behind me. Had someone woken up? Was the shadow moving near the door my mother, watching her last piece of property vanish into the woods? The shadow on the porch didn't move, and neither did I for a heartbeat that felt like an hour. I stood frozen at the edge of the woods, the stolen tobacco tin pressed against my chest. No shout came. No hounds were loosed. Perhaps the mountain mist had played a trick on my eyes, or perhaps my mother had seen me and decided that a runaway girl was easier to explain than a dead one. I didn't wait to find out. I turned and plunged into the thicket, moving toward the sound of the river. I walked for 3 days, to a 9-year-old girl. The trek from the outskirts of Hazard toward Richmond felt like crossing an entire continent. I avoided the main coal roads, terrified that one of my father's old friends, or, worse, one of my brothers would see me. I slept in the hollows of rotted logs and drank water from freezing streams that made my teeth ache. My feet, wrapped in rags and a pair of Roger's oversized work boots I'd scavenged, were blistered and bleeding by the second day. The hunger was a constant. Gnawing companion, but it was different from the hunger at home. This was the hunger of a free person. Every mile I put between myself and that barn made my spirit feel lighter, even as my legs grew heavier. On the third morning, near the edge of a small settlement, I met an old woman hanging laundry behind a modest cabin. She didn't ask for my name or why a child looked like a ghost made of mud and briars. She simply looked into my eyes, went inside, and brought me a thick slice of bread slathered in lard and a cup of warm milk. "You're a long way from home, little one," she whispered. "I'm going to where the mountains end," I replied, my voice raspy from the cold. She pointed me toward a dirt track where the mail trucks ran. Using a few of the coins from Roger's tin, I managed to convince a driver to let me ride in the back, among the letters and packages. As the truck rattled away from the jagged peaks of Hazard, and the land began to flatten out into the rolling hills of the bluegrass, I felt a strange sensation in my chest. For the first time since my father died, I wasn't afraid. I was alone, penniless, and exhausted, but I was the master of my own shadow. When the truck finally pulled into the bustling streets of Richmond, the noise and the people overwhelmed me. I stood on a street corner, clutching my small bundle, a mountain girl in a world of pavement and brick. I had escaped the prison, but now I faced a new challenge. How to build a life when the only thing you own is a stolen tin and a heart full of secrets? Where does a girl with no family go in a city that doesn't know her name? And who was the woman in the white apron who was about to change the course of my life forever? The woman in the white apron was Mrs. Hortons, a widow who ran a small boarding house for railroad workers. When she saw me standing on that corner in Richmond, filthy trembling, but with a gaze that refused to break, she didn't call the authorities. She handed me a broom. "If you can sweep that porch better than the wind does, you can have a hot meal," she said. I didn't just sweep it. I scrubbed it until the wood shined like new. I stayed with her for 3 years, learning that family isn't something you're always born into sometime. It's something you build with your own 2 hands. Eventually, I made my way to Lexington, where the grass was blue and the air felt full of possibility. It was there I met William. He was a quiet man with kind eyes, who never once made me feel like I had to earn my place at the table. When I finally told him about the barn, the dog dish, and the long walk through the mountains, he didn't look at me with pity. He took my calloused hands in his and said, "Helen, the mountains didn't break you, they forged you." Together, we built the life I used to dream about while sleeping on those burlap sacks. We had children who never knew the sound of a cruel word, and grandchildren who only know their grandma Helen as the woman who makes the best apple butter in Kentucky. I never went back to Hazard. I never saw my mother or my 12 brothers again. I chose to leave that poison in the past, knowing that the best revenge was living a life filled with the very love they tried to deny me. My dear ones, I share this with you today because I know there are people watching this who feel like they are still in that barn. You might feel like you were born to suffer, or that the shadows in your life are too tall to climb over. But look at me. I was a 9-year-old girl with nothing but a tobacco tin and a spark of courage, and I made it to the sunlight. You are not a victim of your circumstances. You are the author of your next chapter. If my story touched your heart, I have a special request. Subscribe to this channel and hit that notification bell, because every story shared here is a link in a chain of love that can reach someone who is suffering in silence. And do me one more favor. Leave just one word in the comments, be it hope, freedom, or courage, to show me you stayed with me until the end. Don't wait. Someone out there needs to know that the door to the barn is already unlocked. May God bless you and light your path, always. A big kiss from this grandma, and I'll see you in our next story.